The rain was relentless, turning the city into a blur of gray and silver streaks. Daniel stood under the weak glow of a flickering street lamp, his phone still in his hand, the words from the call echoing in his skull. He was being called in for a meeting he had been dreading for weeks. Not just any meeting, the kind where futures are decided, where careers either survive or vanish quietly in a conference room. His chest felt tight, his palms damp despite the chill in the air. A taxi passed by, spraying a sheet of water that licked the edge of his shoes, but he barely noticed. What he noticed was the pounding in his chest. It wasn't just adrenaline, it was fear, pure and unfiltered, pressing on him like a weight he couldn't shake. And this was not the first time. Fear had been his constant companion for years. It had kept him from asking for the promotion he knew he deserved. It had kept him silent in rooms where he should have spoken up. It had even made him stay in relationships long after they had turned toxic, because the unknown felt more terrifying than the misery he already knew. Daniel started walking toward the office, every step feeling heavier than it should. The rain soaked through his jacket, chilling his skin, but inside he was burning, not with courage, but with that familiar, suffocating heat of anxiety. And in that moment, as he crossed an empty intersection, he realized something. He had never once in his life actually examined fear. He had never asked what it was or why it had such a hold over him. He had only obeyed it. Fear had become his silent commander, and tonight he was starting to wonder if it had been lying to him all along. The elevator ride was short but suffocating. The mirrored walls showed a pale face with tired eyes, but Daniel didn't look away. For the first time, he held his own gaze and felt the weight of a question pressing in. What if fear isn't something that happens to you? What if it's something you allow? The door opened to the corridor. At the far end, the glass-walled conference room glowed warm under yellow light. The silhouettes of 3 people waited inside, their stillness making the space feel like a courtroom. Daniel walked forward, the click of his shoes against the marble floor sounding louder than it should. Halfway there, he remembered something he had read months ago in a book he never finished. A quote from Marcus Aurelius: "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment." At the time, he had brushed past it. Tonight, it felt like the universe had placed those words directly in his path. Fear often disguises itself as an unchangeable truth. But what if it's just a story we've been telling ourselves for years? What if the monster in the room isn't the event we're facing, but the way we've chosen to see it? Hold on to that thought, because the moment you realize fear is optional, everything changes. Daniel sat down at the table, his hands resting on the polished wood, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to make the fear go away. He simply watched it. The voices of the people across from him faded into a low hum as he began to notice something strange. The more he paid attention to the sensation in his chest, the more it began to shift, not vanish, but loosen. It wasn't an enemy, it was just a feeling, a messenger maybe. And like all messengers, it could be heard without being obeyed. One of the executives spoke his name, pulling him back to the moment. He was about to be told whether his position was safe, whether his income, his stability, and his identity would survive the night. But something in him was different now. He realized that whatever news came, he had a choice. Not about the outcome, but about his response. That was the night Daniel decided he was done being ruled by fear. It didn't happen instantly. The truth is, the mind doesn't surrender its habits easily. Even after that night, fear still showed up. In boardrooms, in conversations, in the quiet moments at home when the bills piled up. But Daniel began to study it, not fight it, not run from it, but understand it. And that's when he discovered Stoic philosophy. Not as an abstract idea, but as a survival tool. He started small. Morning walks before sunrise where he would let his thoughts drift and settle. a journal on his nightstand where he wrote down the fears that circled his mind like vultures. And each time he challenged them, is this thing truly a threat or just a shadow? The Stoics had a word for this practice, separating what is within our control from what is not. And when Daniel began to see that most of his fear was built on things he couldn't control, he realized how much of his life had been wasted. Think about it. How many decisions have you made because of fear? How many opportunities have you let slip by, not because you couldn't take them, but because fear convinced you not to try? Imagine if that voice in your head wasn't in charge anymore. What would you do differently tomorrow morning? The first real test came just a week later. Daniel was invited to give a short presentation at a client meeting. Nothing major, at least on paper, but in his mind, public speaking had always been a nightmare dressed in business casual. His hands would sweat, his voice would tighten, and every second felt like an hour of being judged. He almost said no. In fact, the email draft with a polite excuse was already typed out. But before he hit send, he remembered a passage from Epictetus he had read the night before. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. He looked at the screen and asked himself, what's the worst that can actually happen? Embarrassment? A few awkward stumbles? Even if that happened, would his life really change? And if not, then why did his body react like this was a life or death situation? He deleted the draft and typed 2 words instead: I'm in. The morning of the presentation, he woke early and went for his usual walk. The city was still waking up, the sky a pale shade of silver, the sidewalks dotted with paper coffee cups and the scent of fresh bagels drifting from the corner bakery. He breathed in deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. Marcus Aurelius had once written, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Today, Daniel would put that to the test. In the conference room, as the projector flickered to life, the familiar hum of fear returned. But this time, Daniel didn't fight it. He imagined it like a guest sitting quietly in the back of the room, not welcome, but harmless. As he began to speak, he focused on what he could control: his breath, his pace, his tone. By the time he reached his last slide, he realized something incredible. The fear had never left. It had simply stopped being the one holding the microphone. Fear doesn't always vanish when you confront it. Sometimes it stays, but loses its authority over you. The real victory isn't making fear disappear. It's living fully, even while it's sitting right next to you. Over the following months, Daniel started treating fear like a weather pattern. Something that comes and goes, but not something he has to obey. He began testing himself with small acts of defiance. When his instinct was to avoid, he leaned in instead, calling back a client who had complained instead of letting it slide, speaking up in a meeting when he had an idea, even if his voice shook, declining invitations that drained his time even when people might not like it. Each time he felt the same initial spike of discomfort, but each time the aftermath was lighter than he expected. The world didn't collapse. No one was keeping a secret scoreboard of his mistakes. And little by little, he began to see fear for what it was. Not a wall, but a thin curtain, one you could walk through if you stopped assuming it was made of steel. There were setbacks, of course. The day his manager blindsided him with a last-minute pitch in front of the entire department, his chest tightened so much he could barely breathe. His old self would have seen that as proof he hadn't changed. But Stoicism taught him that progress isn't about never stumbling. It's about noticing that you get back up faster each time. He began to write down his fears in the same way some people track their workouts, not to obsess over them, but to measure how much ground he was gaining. He noticed patterns. Most fears were about things that hadn't happened yet, and often never would. They were ghosts of possibilities, not realities. How much of your fear is about something happening right now, and how much of it is just a movie playing in your head, a story that hasn't and might never come true? What would happen if you stopped buying tickets to that show? One evening, Daniel sat in his apartment with the journal open, the city lights casting long stripes of gold and shadow across the floor. He reread an entry from months ago, a list of fears that, at the time, felt like chains. Losing his job, being rejected by a woman he liked, failing in front of his peers. Strangely, some of those things had actually happened since then. He had lost a client, a date had ended awkwardly, he had stumbled in a meeting, and yet here he was, still standing, still breathing, still moving forward. It struck him then, fear had been selling him an illusion of protection. By avoiding pain, he thought he was keeping himself safe. In reality, he had just been keeping himself small. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the email landed in his inbox. Subject line, immediate review, attendance required. His heart sank before he even opened it. The message was short, clinical, and cold. He was to attend an emergency board meeting the next morning to address concerns regarding recent performance and client retention. Old Daniel would have spiraled immediately. He would have called 3 colleagues to speculate, replayed every mistake he'd made in the past month, and barely slept. That reflex still tried to kick in, whispering in his ear like a cunning old friend, "This is it. They've found a reason to cut you. You're done." But something in him had shifted in the past months. He closed the email without reading it twice, stood up, and went for a walk. The autumn air was crisp, each breath a reminder that the world outside his mind was still calm, still steady. He remembered a line from Seneca, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." He repeated it in his head until it felt like a shield. That night, instead of pacing the apartment, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote down every possible outcome of the meeting. From the worst to the best. Fired? Possible but survivable. Demoted? Maybe, but not fatal. Given more responsibility? Also possible. What he realized was that no outcome could touch the core of who he was. They could alter his circumstances, but not his principles. And those principles he now knew were his true security. The next morning, he walked into the boardroom, not fearless, but free. Fear was there, sitting at the corner of the table like an uninvited guest, but it no longer ran the meeting. He listened carefully, answered directly, and didn't sugarcoat mistakes. He owned them. The discussion was intense, but it ended with an unexpected twist. Instead of cutting him loose, they offered him the lead on a challenging new project. Here's the paradox. The moment you stop letting fear control you, people notice. They may not call it stoicism, but they see the steadiness, the calm under pressure, and they respond to it. When you stop clinging, opportunities often find their way to you. The project was brutal, long hours demanding clients and stakes that made his earlier fears look like shadows. But it was also a proving ground. Daniel started treating each challenge like the Stoics treated life's trials, as training for the mind. Marcus Aurelius compared adversity to the fire that tests gold. Daniel began to understand. The work didn't just test his skills, it tested his discipline, his patience, his ability to remain centered when everything around him wavered. One night, near the end of the project, he stayed late at the office. The city outside was lit up, the streets below flowing with red taillights like a river of fire. He realized he had been living for weeks under constant uncertainty, yet the fear that once dictated his every move now felt quiet. Not gone, but stripped of its power. It occurred to him that fear is like a muscle. The less you feed it, the weaker it gets. And the more you exercise courage, the more natural it becomes. Courage stops feeling like an extraordinary act and starts feeling like your default state. What if the only difference between the person you are and the person you want to be is the number of times you've said yes to something that scared you? How many moments of your life are still waiting behind that one choice? It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. Daniel was at a small cafe he loved, the kind with mismatched chairs, the hiss of an espresso machine, and sunlight spilling through dusty windows. He was halfway through his coffee when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen froze him. Emily. They hadn't spoken in almost a year. The last time they did, it ended badly. A silence born not from anger, but from fear. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of saying what he really felt. Fear of losing someone by showing too much. He'd let that fear write the ending of a chapter he wasn't ready to close. For a moment, he considered letting the call go to voicemail, but then he caught himself. This was the old script: avoidance, control through retreat. He took a deep breath and answered. Her voice was softer than he remembered. She wanted to meet, she said. There was something she needed to tell him. They agreed to meet at the park near the river that afternoon. As he walked there, the wind carried the scent of wet leaves and the faint sound of children playing in the distance. He could feel his heartbeat quicken. What if she was seeing someone else? What if she only wanted closure? What if she said something that would reopen wounds he had only just learned to live with? He stopped mid-step. These were all what-ifs. Projections, not facts. He remembered Epictetus again. When I see an anxious person, I ask myself, what do they want? For if a person wasn't wanting something outside their own control, why would they be stricken by anxiety? What did he want? To be understood, to be chosen. Those things weren't within his control, but speaking with honesty, listening without defensiveness, those were. That's where he would stand. They sat on a bench by the water. The conversation was slow at first, but eventually the walls came down. She told him she had been scared too. Scared of getting hurt, scared of losing herself. Fear had been the third person in their relationship, always whispering doubts. They both had listened. This time, Daniel didn't promise what he couldn't control. He didn't try to force a future or protect himself by holding back. He simply spoke the truth, that he cared, that he regretted letting fear dictate his choices, and that whatever came next, he would rather face it honestly than live behind a shield. When they parted, there was no grand reconciliation, no movie-perfect ending. But there was peace. He walked away lighter, not because the outcome was certain, but because he had finally learned that courage isn't about guarantees. It's about showing up without them. Fear will always offer you the easy way out. Silence instead of speaking. Retreat instead of advancing. But the easy way rarely leads where you want to go. The hard road, the one that asks for your full heart without a safety net, is almost always where your real life begins. Over the next year, Daniel carried that same approach into every part of his life. At work, he stopped over-preparing as a shield and started preparing as an act of clarity. With friends, he said what needed to be said, even when it risked discomfort. And in moments of solitude, he stopped trying to escape his thoughts and learned to sit with them until they revealed something worth knowing. The result wasn't a fearless life. That's a fantasy. The result was a life where fear was no longer the compass. Stoic philosophy had taught him that while we can't control the wind, we can adjust the sails. And Daniel had finally turned his boat toward the open water. Maybe the question isn't how do I get rid of fear, but what would I do if I stopped letting fear decide for me? Because when you realize fear is a choice, you also realize courage is too. A few months later, life tested Daniel again. This time, not with the tremors of personal relationships or the controlled chaos of a corporate project, but with something heavier. His father had a stroke. The call came late in the evening. Daniel drove 2 hours to the small hospital in his hometown, the dark highway stretching ahead like an endless ribbon. With every mile, the voice of fear tried to creep back in. What if he doesn't wake up? What if I never get to say what I should have said? By the time he reached the sterile, white-lit hallway outside the ICU, his chest felt tight. But he remembered what the Stoics taught about control. He couldn't change what had already happened. He couldn't dictate the outcome. What he could control was how he met the moment, whether with panic and paralysis or with presence. He sat by his father's bedside. Machines beeped steadily, their rhythm filling the silences between breaths. His father's face looked older, thinner, but peaceful. Daniel took his hand, feeling the cool skin against his palm. He didn't try to force words, didn't let his mind race into imagined futures. He simply sat, breathing slowly, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. And strangely, under the uncertainty, he felt a quiet strength. He wasn't pushing the fear away, he was making room for it, without letting it crowd out everything else. Over the next week, Daniel stayed in his hometown, balancing hospital visits with remote work. There were good days and bad, small signs of recovery and sudden setbacks. But each time, fear tried to grip him, in the form of late-night dread or the tightness in his chest when doctors spoke. He reminded himself, this feeling is not the event. This is just my mind reacting to it, and my mind is mine to command. Fear will always try to convince you that it's the same thing as reality, but reality is what's in front of you, right now, not the catastrophes your mind is rehearsing. The more you can separate the two, the more freedom you find. When his father finally regained enough strength to speak a few sentences, one of the first things he said was, "I'm proud of you." It wasn't about Daniel's job, his achievements, or even his actions over the past week. It was about the way he had been steady, present, and calm when everything around them was uncertain. That, more than anything, was the mark of a man who had learned to live with fear without kneeling to it. Back in the city, Daniel noticed that his relationship with fear had changed in subtle ways. The things that used to feel enormous, a critical email, a tense conversation, a financial setback, now seemed smaller, like waves breaking against a rock that had been there for centuries. He didn't avoid challenges anymore. In fact, he started seeking them out, not recklessly, but as deliberate training. One weekend, he signed up for a rock climbing course with a few colleagues. Heights had always unsettled him. Standing at the base of a cliff, helmet strapped on, rope coiled at his feet, he could feel his pulse in his fingertips. But instead of trying to erase the fear, he let it stay, treating it like a background hum. Step by step, he climbed. Every hold was a choice, to move despite the tremor in his legs. At the top, looking out over the valley, wind brushing against his face, he understood something that months of reading Stoic philosophy had been building toward. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear make your decisions. Fear is loudest at the bottom of the climb, but every step you take toward the summit teaches it something, that you're willing to listen, but not to obey. After that day, Daniel began treating life as a series of climbs. Some were small, sending a bold proposal to a client, introducing himself to a stranger at a networking event. Others were steep and exhausting, confronting someone he respected when they crossed a line, making a financial risk for a project he believed in. Each climb left him with the same truth. The terrain outside mattered far less than the terrain inside. And yet, even as he grew more resilient, life was preparing another test, one that would make every previous challenge feel like a warm-up. It was coming quietly, like a storm building far off the coast, and when it hit, it would ask him one final question. Now that you know fear is a choice, will you still choose courage when it costs you everything? It was a late autumn evening when the storm hit. Daniel had driven out to the coast for a weekend alone, craving the sound of waves and the sharp bite of salt in the air. The forecast had mentioned heavy rain, but by nightfall, it had turned into something far more violent. Wind tore at the shoreline, rain lashed sideways, and the ocean roared like a living thing. He was about to head back to his cabin when he noticed a figure down by the rocks. A man, maybe in his 50s, struggling against the current near the edge of the water. At first, Daniel thought it was just the storm playing tricks on his eyes. But then he saw the man slip, fall, and vanish into the churning dark. Fear hit him instantly, that primal surge that makes your body want to freeze or flee. The voice in his head screamed, "You're not trained for this. You could die out there. Call for help. Wait." But another voice, quieter, steadier, cut through. "If this were you, wouldn't you want someone to move?" Daniel didn't waste time calculating odds. He threw off his jacket, kicked off his shoes, and ran toward the rocks. The cold hit like a shock of electricity when he plunged into the water, but he kept moving, eyes locked on the flashes of movement ahead. Every wave felt like it could rip him under, every breath was a battle, but he kept reminding himself of one thing: the fear is here, it's not going away. But I'm still the one deciding my next move. When he finally reached the man, they both went under for a moment. Salt burned his eyes, his chest screamed for air, but he tightened his grip and kicked hard. By the time they reached the shore, both of them were coughing, shivering, but alive. The man couldn't stop thanking him, but Daniel barely heard the words. He was staring out at the raging ocean, realizing how close he had come to turning away, and the thought chilled him more than the water. Not the risk he'd taken, but the life he might have lived if fear had been his default choice. When the moment comes, and it will, fear won't politely step aside to let courage through. They'll both arrive together, and you'll have to choose who you move with. That choice will define you far more than the outcome ever will. In the days after, Daniel found himself replaying the night in his mind, not with pride, but with a kind of sober gratitude. The rescue wasn't a Hollywood moment of heroism. It was a messy, exhausting, dangerous act. But it proved something he'd suspected for months. The training ground for courage is built in the everyday, in the small moments when you refuse to let fear dictate the tone of your voice, the depth of your love, or the risks you're willing to take. He thought of Marcus Aurelius's words: "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." And he realized that every time he'd chosen courage over fear, he'd been choosing to live fully, even if imperfectly. The storm had passed, but something in him had shifted permanently. He no longer chased a fearless life. Instead, he lived with the knowledge that fear would always walk beside him, but it didn't have to lead. Weeks after the storm, Daniel returned to the same stretch of coastline. The sky was calm this time, the ocean stretched blue and silver under the winter sun. He walked along the shore, tracing the path he'd taken that night, hearing again the roar of the waves, feeling again the cold that had wrapped around his bones. But now it was quiet, almost serene. It struck him that the ocean hadn't changed. The same waters that had threatened to take a life that night were now gentle, even beautiful. It wasn't the sea that determined whether it was terrifying or peaceful. It was the conditions, the moment, the way you met it. Fear, he realized, was the same. It could be a raging storm or a calm horizon. The ocean was just water. Fear was just feeling. Neither had to decide your actions unless you let them. He picked up a smooth stone and turned it in his hand. The Stoics often compared life to a voyage. The wind and waves beyond your control, the steering of the ship entirely yours. In the end, storms aren't there to punish you. They're there to prove the strength of your helm. Daniel thought back to the moments that had shaped the last year. The boardroom panic, the park bench conversation with Emily, the quiet hours in the ICU, the dizzying height of the cliff, the chaos of the ocean. Each time fear had been present. Each time he had been asked to choose. And with each choice, courage had grown a little easier, not because fear had weakened, but because he had stopped confusing it for truth. As he walked away from the water, he felt lighter, not because the future was certain, but because he no longer needed it to be. Fear could walk beside him for the rest of his life if it wanted. It just wouldn't get to touch the wheel. Maybe the real measure of strength isn't how little fear you feel, but how little it owns of you. And when you finally see that fear is a choice, you realize that courage has been waiting in your hands all along. Steady, quiet, ready to steer you toward the life you were meant to live.